The world was at war, a time when compassion seemed buried beneath the rubble of hatred and loss. The year was 1942, and the Pacific was a sea of fire. Japanese soldiers, once devoted to the code of the warrior, now found themselves prisoners behind enemy lines. For them, surrender was not just defeat. It was shame, the destruction of identity itself. Yet within the walls of the Allied camps, something impossible began to stir. Behind the barbed wire, where silence and suspicion ruled, humanity quietly began to bloom again. Soldiers who were taught to despise their captors began to see something unfamiliar in their eyes, not cruelty but kindness. Nurses tending to wounds that once shed the blood of their own countrymen, guards offering food instead of fear, and villagers greeting strangers not with hatred but with cautious compassion. In the shadow of one of the most brutal wars in history, a new kind of battle began, one between duty and emotion, between loyalty to the past and the awakening of something deeply human. Among those who were supposed to hate one another, hearts began to change. Some would call it betrayal, others would call it redemption. But for those who lived it, it was something far more profound. The discovery that even in the darkest times, love does not recognize the borders drawn by war. When Japan entered the Second World War, its soldiers were among the most disciplined and fiercely loyal in the world. The Imperial Japanese Army fought with an unyielding sense of duty, bound by the code of Bushido, a belief that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Dying for the emperor was seen as the highest honor, while capture was considered a stain that could never be washed away. This mindset made the treatment of Japanese prisoners of war unlike that of any other group during the conflict. Many Japanese soldiers, cornered on the battlefield, chose suicide rather than face the humiliation of capture. Yet thousands were taken alive, especially after key Allied victories in the Pacific. These men, stripped of their weapons and their pride, suddenly found themselves on foreign soil as captives of the enemy they had once sworn to destroy. In Australia, thousands of Japanese POWs were transported to remote camps surrounded by open fields and watchtowers. The guards were often young men themselves, many of whom had fought in brutal engagements against the same prisoners now in their care. Initially, tension ran high. The Japanese prisoners refused to speak, eat, or cooperate. They viewed the Allied soldiers not as fellow humans, but as symbols of their disgrace. Yet over time, the routines of camp life began to soften the edges of hostility. Daily work assignments, organized meals, and medical treatment introduced an unfamiliar rhythm, one where survival no longer depended on violence. Across the ocean in the United States, Japanese prisoners were kept in large compounds spread across states like California, Texas, and Idaho. Despite the lingering resentment from Pearl Harbor, many American camp commanders insisted on humane treatment, believing that discipline and decency would yield more than cruelty. Some POWs were even allowed to work on nearby farms, helping with the harvests, while local civilians cautiously watched from a distance. For the Americans, these prisoners were not faceless enemies, but men trying to endure a war they had lost control over. In Britain, the situation was similar. Japanese POWs, though fewer in number, were held under close supervision, but treated within the guidelines of the Geneva Convention. British officers saw their captivity not as revenge, but as an opportunity to demonstrate moral superiority, to prove that the Allies stood for more than just victory on the battlefield. Through these camps in different corners of the world, an unexpected experiment in humanity was taking place. The men who had once charged each other across jungles and oceans were now forced to coexist. The hatred that had fueled entire nations began to give way, slowly, to curiosity. It was within these strange and quiet places, far from the front lines, that the seeds of something remarkable were sown. Life inside the prisoner of war camps began as a blur of confusion, silence, and humiliation. For the Japanese soldiers, the sudden transformation from proud warriors to captives was a psychological wound deeper than any battlefield injury. Many refused to believe they were still alive. To them, survival in captivity was dishonor, a living death. On their first days in the camps, they bowed their heads, avoided eye contact, and spoke little even among themselves. The Allied guards observed this strange discipline with curiosity. They expected resistance, perhaps even violence, but what they found instead was a quiet, rigid order. The prisoners cleaned their living quarters with precision, stood in formation without command, and followed rules that the guards had not yet given. At first, there was no bridge between the two sides. The guards carried rifles not only as weapons, but as shields against the tension that filled the air. Every meal was served in silence. Every glance was an unspoken reminder of the war still raging beyond the barbed wire. When Allied soldiers offered food or cigarettes, the Japanese men would hesitate, unsure whether to accept what they considered gifts from the enemy or traps meant to test their loyalty. They maintained strict internal discipline, sometimes punishing one another for perceived disobedience to the emperor's honor, even within captivity. But time, as it always does, began to erode the sharp edges of hostility. The guards realized that their prisoners were not fanatical beasts, but human beings who missed their homes, their families, and the dignity they had once carried in their uniforms. Small gestures began to change the rhythm of camp life. A guard sharing a cup of coffee, a nurse tending to a wounded hand without anger, a translator teaching a few words of English to a curious prisoner. Each act, seemingly insignificant, broke through the invisible wall of enmity. Over weeks and months, the Japanese prisoners adjusted to the strange normalcy of camp life. They began to work in gardens, kitchens, and workshops. Some were assigned to build or repair furniture, others to grow vegetables in the barren soil that surrounded the camps. The work gave them a sense of purpose, a faint echo of the discipline they had lived by as soldiers. Slowly, laughter began to return, not loud but hesitant, cautious, as though the men were testing whether it was still allowed. The guards, too, began to change. They stopped seeing the captives as faceless foes from wartime propaganda and started recognizing them as individuals. They learned names, habits, and personalities. Some prisoners were polite and reserved, others curious and even cheerful once they sensed kindness. Letters were occasionally allowed, though few arrived from home. For many Japanese POWs, news from Japan was a painful reminder of defeat and destruction. The guards, seeing their quiet sorrow, sometimes offered words of comfort they could barely translate. Seasons passed, and the camps began to take on a rhythm of their own, a fragile balance between authority and understanding. The barbed wire remained, but within it a strange peace began to grow. The men who once charged at each other with bayonets were now sharing tools, food, and fragments of conversation. It was not friendship yet, nor forgiveness, but it was the beginning of something both sides had thought impossible: recognition of their shared humanity. As months turned into years, the war outside continued to rage, but inside the camps, another quiet transformation was unfolding, one that few could have predicted. The boundaries between captor and captive began to blur, not through politics or treaties, but through simple acts of humanity. Japanese prisoners who had once stood in silence now found themselves working alongside Allied civilians, farmers, laborers, and nurses who entered the camps to provide assistance or oversee projects. The first exchanges were cautious and formal, each side unsure of how far decency could extend between enemies. But human nature, resilient and unpredictable, began to write a different story. In several camps across Australia, local women volunteered to help with medical treatment and education programs for the prisoners. Many of these women had lost brothers or fathers in the Pacific, yet they chose compassion over hatred. One nurse recalled that the first time she treated a Japanese soldier's wound, he refused to look at her, his face rigid with shame. She simply said, "You're safe now," and continued her work in silence. Over the weeks that followed, he began to greet her with a quiet nod each morning. It was a small gesture, but within the silence of captivity it meant everything. There were also cases in which deeper bonds formed, bonds that defied both military law and social expectation. In one Australian camp in Cowra, where a massive breakout had once ended in tragedy, the surviving Japanese prisoners later formed unexpected friendships with local townspeople who had helped bury the dead. The kindness shown during those moments of mourning changed perceptions on both sides. The locals no longer saw them as the faceless enemy from propaganda posters, and the prisoners began to view Australians not as conquerors, but as fellow human beings capable of respect and understanding. In the United States, Japanese POWs working on farms came into contact with American families. Some were invited to share meals under close supervision, others exchanged small gifts, hand-carved wooden trinkets, origami animals, or painted stones, as tokens of gratitude. There were rare but documented instances of affection developing between POWs and young women who worked or volunteered nearby. Such relationships were never publicly acknowledged and were often forbidden by military authorities. Yet they reveal how powerful the pull of human connection can be, even in the shadow of war. In Britain, where a smaller number of Japanese prisoners were held, a few were employed in rebuilding projects after the bombings. Local civilians, seeing them work silently amid the ruins, were struck by their discipline and humility. Some British nurses who tended to injured prisoners later wrote in their diaries that they had felt unexpected sympathy for men who, only months earlier, had been portrayed as merciless foes. These were not romantic confessions in most cases, but they reflected the same current of emotional reconciliation that was spreading quietly through the camps. What made these moments extraordinary was not just their rarity, but their defiance of everything the war had taught both sides to believe. For the Japanese prisoners, any sign of affection toward the enemy could be seen as betrayal of their homeland. For the Allied civilians, showing kindness to the captives of a nation responsible for so much suffering was difficult and often criticized. Yet in these fragile exchanges, a shared smile, a brief conversation, a handwritten note, the idea of humanity triumphed over propaganda. By the time the war neared its end, these relationships had become silent testaments to the resilience of compassion. They did not erase the horrors of the battlefield, but they stood as quiet reminders that even in a world torn apart by hatred, love, and understanding could still find a way to exist. For the Japanese prisoners, the experience of captivity was not only physical confinement, but an intense inner conflict between two worlds that could not have been more different. Raised under the Bushido Code, they were taught from childhood that loyalty to the emperor and to one's comrades was absolute, that death in battle was the highest honor, and that surrender was a disgrace that would bring shame upon one's family. Within that code, mercy from the enemy was unthinkable, because mercy implied superiority, and for a soldier to accept it was to lose all dignity. Yet in Allied camps across Australia, the United States and Britain, these men encountered something that their upbringing had not prepared them for. They were treated not as beasts to be broken, but as human beings. Their wounds were bandaged, their hunger met with food, and their silence with patience. For many, this kindness was more difficult to endure than cruelty would have been. At first, some prisoners resisted it entirely. They believed that the compassion shown to them was part of a psychological strategy, a trick meant to weaken their spirit. But as months passed, that suspicion began to fade, replaced by confusion and, for some, guilt. The Bushido spirit had not taught them how to respond to empathy. In the Japanese worldview of that time, honor was external. It came from obedience, sacrifice, and reputation. But what they found among the Westerners was a different kind of strength, one rooted in forgiveness, moral principle, and faith in the individual. This clash of values created deep emotional turmoil. Some prisoners began questioning the very foundations of what they had been taught to believe. Could an enemy who offered kindness truly be evil? Could surrender, if it led to understanding, still be shameful? A few even began to reflect on the propaganda they had once accepted without question. In this sense, the camps became not only places of imprisonment, but of quiet transformation. For the Allied guards and civilians, the cultural divide was just as challenging. They had been taught to see the Japanese soldier as ruthless and fanatical, yet what they saw behind the barbed wire were young men struggling to reconcile duty with despair. Many guards described moments when their prisoners bowed in deep respect before receiving even the smallest favor. It was a gesture rooted in the old code of honor, but now mixed with a growing sense of gratitude that transcended national pride. In small ways, the two cultures began to learn from each other. The Westerners admired the prisoners' discipline, endurance, and dignity, even in captivity. The Japanese, in turn, were moved by the quiet strength of compassion, the idea that mercy was not weakness, but moral courage. This meeting of two moral worlds, once separated by war, gave birth to something fragile yet profound: mutual respect. When the war finally neared its end, many Japanese prisoners found themselves changed in ways they could not easily explain. They would return to a homeland still governed by the ideals of honor and sacrifice, but within them, something new had taken root. They had glimpsed another kind of strength, one that did not come from victory or obedience but from empathy and understanding. It was this internal conflict, the struggle between the code they were born into and the humanity they had discovered, that defined the most enduring legacy of their captivity. When the war finally came to an end in 1945, the Japanese prisoners were faced with the daunting task of returning home. The camps that had once felt like cages now seemed strangely familiar, even safe compared to the uncertainty that awaited them beyond the barbed wire. Many had heard rumors of Japan's devastation, cities reduced to ash, families lost, an emperor who had spoken to his people for the first time in history to announce surrender. For these men, returning home meant confronting not only a ruined nation, but also the deep shame of having survived as prisoners. The process of repatriation was slow and emotional. The Allied guards, who had once watched them with suspicion, now shook their hands and wished them peace. Some even wept as the ships departed. For both sides, it was a farewell that carried far more meaning than anyone had expected. The prisoners, who had learned the language, mannerisms, and kindness of their captors, left behind a strange silence, proof that understanding had somehow grown between enemies. When they reached Japan, many former POWs found themselves isolated and misunderstood. Their families often greeted them with relief and sorrow, but their communities saw them through the lens of dishonor. Few spoke openly about their experiences, yet some carried letters, photographs, and tokens from the people they had met during captivity. A handful even tried to maintain contact with their former guards or nurses, writing letters that crossed oceans and languages. For a few, these connections had grown into deep affection, or even love, bonds that could not easily survive the distance and disapproval of post-war societies. There were rare cases where these relationships led to marriage, though they were often met with resistance from both sides. In Japan, a woman marrying a former enemy or a man returning with affection for a Westerner was almost unthinkable. In Allied nations, families who had lost loved ones in the war struggled to accept unions with those who had once worn the enemy's uniform. Still, the few who succeeded became quiet symbols of reconciliation, proving that love could indeed rise from the ruins of hatred. For most, however, the war left behind only memories of compassion shown in unexpected moments, of forgiveness discovered in the unlikeliest of places. Decades later, some Japanese veterans returned to the sites of their imprisonment, laying flowers and meeting with the descendants of those who had once guarded them. They spoke not of war but of peace, of how captivity had taught them what true strength meant. These stories, though scattered and often forgotten, reveal a side of humanity rarely seen in the chronicles of war. They remind us that even when nations are divided by violence and ideology, individuals can still find a way to understand one another. The Japanese prisoners who once believed they had lost their honor found something far greater instead: the knowledge that dignity can be restored not through victory, but through compassion. In their quiet way, they became living proof that even in the darkest hours of history, humanity endures. In the vast chronicles of war, where numbers and dates often overshadow the beating hearts within them, the story of the Japanese prisoners stands apart as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They entered captivity burdened with shame, convinced that honor had abandoned them forever. Yet what they discovered behind enemy lines was something no code of war could have prepared them for: the quiet power of empathy. In the hands that once carried weapons, they found kindness. In the eyes of those they had called the enemy, they saw compassion. These moments of connection did not erase the pain or the losses that defined the war, but they carved small pathways toward understanding. They showed that beneath the uniforms, the languages, and the propaganda, people remained capable of love and forgiveness. For those who dared to see beyond hatred, captivity became not only a prison but a mirror, reflecting what it truly means to be human. As the years passed and the wounds of the Second World War slowly healed, these stories of unexpected friendship and love continued to echo quietly across generations. They remind us that reconciliation does not begin with treaties or politics, but with simple acts of mercy, with one heart choosing to see another as equal. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest victory of all: not the triumph of one nation over another, but the triumph of humanity over the darkness of war.